Welcome to A Different Frame. I'm your co-host, Anisha.
And I'm Kendra.
And this is a podcast for the people, by the people. Now, the show is made possible by Alabama Values Progress, a media advocacy organization that is dedicated to breaking the cycle of misinformation during the times where the truth is hard to find. So pretty much we're delivering facts, data, and receipts on what's happening in Alabama. And today's episode titled, This New Jim Crow Gots to Go, Why Alabama Keeps Putting Prisons Over People. We are joined by Veronica Johnson, interim executive director at the Alabama Justice Initiative, and Blair Bowie, director of Restore Your Vote, a project of the Campaign Legal Center. So let's dive into today's episode. Kendra, why don't you tell everybody what we have on tap for today?
Hey y'all, so today we'll discuss an important issue in Alabama's prisons. And as Anisha said, we're joined by Veronica Johnson, interim executive director at Alabama Justice Initiative. And Veronica has more than 15 years of experience in juvenile justice and as a social justice activist. She's also the founder of Cupcakes and Combos, a mentoring program for at-risk teen girls. We're also joined by Blair Bowie, who directs Campaign Legal Center's Restore Your Vote project, which focuses on ending felony disenfranchisement by democratizing access to rights restoration services and working with directly impacted communities to dismantle systemic barriers. Thank y'all for coming today.
Yes, thank y'all so much for joining us. So today's episode, y'all, we know that Alabama's prisons have come under scrutiny in recent years for its inhumane treatment of incarcerated individuals. Reports of overcrowding, violence, and neglect have sparked public outcry and calls for reform. It is past time for Alabama to address the systemic issues in its prisons. Unfortunately, Alabama's prisons have been plagued by systemic problems for many years. This is not new. Right? Some of the key issues, we mentioned, overcrowding, understaffing, inadequate medical care, and high levels of violence. The prisons, the conditions are just so bad that they literally violate the 8th Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Justice launched an investigation into Alabama's prisons, citing concerns about the high levels of violence, the lack of mental health services, and the inadequate staffing levels. Just yesterday, the Woods Foundation hosted a vigil on the steps of the Alabama's Capitol, where family members and friends of inmates that have passed due to the harsh conditions, told their stories and honored their loved ones. It was very sad that they even had to get up there and share those stories and have that conversation and plead with our state to do what's right. Multiple families told stories of getting notice about their loved ones' deaths through social media or a call or a text from another inmate. Most families were never contacted by the prison warden or staff. This was just, this issue is problematic and must be addressed. And today, even with today's episode, we're making sure that we raise awareness, we shine a light on what's going on, and also tell people how they can get involved, in the solution.
That's so right, Anisha. Alabama's prisons have a long history of violence and neglect. And there are reports of physical and sexual abuse by prison staff that have been documented, as have incidents of violence among incarcerated individuals. And then the lack of oversight and accountability has allowed this culture of violence to persist, leading to a situation where incarcerated individuals are not even safe in their own cells. Our prisons neglect the basic needs of incarcerated individuals, and reports are coming in of inadequate food, limited access to medical care, and unsanitary living conditions that are widespread throughout all the prisons in Alabama. This neglect has led to preventable illnesses, injuries, and deaths among incarcerated individuals. And in recent years, the situation's only gotten worse with reports of violence, abuse, and neglect. And specifically in September, the family of Costello Vaughn, who is serving a 20-year sentence at an Elmore County prison for burglary, told news media that they feared for their brother's life. And so their family received some harrowing photos of their brother from another inmate, and it showed him slumped over, weak, and he had a large wound on his abdomen where he had undergone surgery to remove a part of his intestine. They said he was just really in bad shape, and they really just feared that he wasn't going to make it, which is super duper sad. Issues such as this have led to an inmate strike in the fall, where inmates initiated a labor strike, And some prisoners reported that they weren't even having access to being fed that day or even having access to the medical care that they required. Then there's the fact that the Department of Corrections has botched several executions, and one of the botched executions was where an inmate was executed, but it was determined by independent autopsy that the execution was inhumane. The autopsy report found that there was evidence that there were multiple attempts at injection, as there were incisions that appeared to have been made before the man was sedated. Then the autopsy showed that the state executioners mutilated him as he was conscious and then presented him to reporters where he had already been at death's door. I know that during this particular incident, they didn't let reporters in to the execution chamber as they normally do because they were doing whatever they were doing while they were watching the execution. So then they were just like, it was almost like they laid him out there to parade him around. So I want to pose a question for Blair. What do you think are the leading issues plaguing Alabama's criminal justice system? And Veronica, feel free to chime in too.
Yeah, thanks Anisha and Kendra for having me. I think that one of the biggest issues that I'll point out is something that you've both already spoken to and alluded to here, is just the lack of accountability for the prison system and for the criminal legal system in Alabama. And this is really closely related with the problem of felony disenfranchisement in Alabama. So in Alabama, as you know, there are hundreds of thousands of people who have been convicted of felonies. Some of them are currently incarcerated. Many of them are out back in their communities. But a lot of those folks have been denied the right to vote by felony disenfranchisement laws. And what that means in this context is that the people who are most directly impacted by the prison system have their most important political tool, their right to vote, taken away from them. And so that makes it really hard for the people who know what's going on in these prisons and the people who have experienced firsthand all the problems you're describing to hold public officials accountable for these problems. And this really makes a lot of sense when you think about the history of why Alabama has felony disenfranchisement in the first place. Going back into that, Alabama first put felony disenfranchisement on the books in 1901 when it passed its racist Jim Crow Constitution. The point of this Constitution, the framers who were creating it said openly, was to reimpose white supremacy the way it had been before the Civil War, and to effectively control and re-enslave Black folks in Alabama. So they expanded the criminal legal system. They made up a lot of crimes that would allow them to incarcerate people and therefore get free labor out of them, reestablishing slavery through the prison system. And at the same time, to make sure that they couldn't be held accountable for that, they took the right to vote away from people who were convicted of these crimes that they deemed crimes of moral turpitude. And that law is still basically on the books in Alabama. So that has served to allow for this sort of spiraling of an unaccountable criminal legal system that gets us where we are today. But the good news is that Alabama is one of only a handful of states where some people in prison actually have the right to vote. There are a lot of people who are locked up who were not convicted of crimes of moral turpitude, and therefore they still have that right to vote. And if those folks could access the ballot, we could see a lot more accountability on the elected officials who are responsible for their care and their living conditions.
Yeah, thanks for unpacking that, Blair. I mean, it's just so much there, right? An unjust criminal justice system, I mean, that's oxymoronic in itself, right? Has such a significant impact, not only on those who are incarcerated, but also those who are not. The systemic issues within, our criminal justice system, such as over-policing, racial profiling, harsh sentencing, have led to an increase in the number of individuals who are incarcerated, particularly from marginalized communities, people of color communities. And this has created this cycle of inequality that affects both those who are incarcerated and those who are not. And navigating this system, I know that's a lot, both of your orgs, Blair and Veronica, help people navigate the system for different, reasons, but navigating the criminal justice system can be challenging and overwhelming, particularly for those who don't have access to legal representation or an understanding of how the system works for and against them. people from low income backgrounds may not have the resources to hire like a private attorney. And then our public defenders often have these high, caseloads and limited resources. And sometimes this leads to situations where individuals are not adequately represented, resulting in unfair treatment and unjust outcomes. And I can just go down a list of this cycle. But Veronica, I wanted to pose this question to you. What are some of the ways that the Alabama Justice Initiative is offering direct support for, communities to navigate, the system, whether it's through getting them piped in with representation or educational programs? Just want to put that out there.
Thank you. Again, thank you all so much for having me. I want to piggyback off the first question that Kendra asked. So in order to fully understand the issue of mass incarceration of Alabama, you have to understand how slavery impacted Alabama as it stands today. So most of the wealthier people in this country, any white person that's obtained wealth in this country mostly did it off the backs of slaves. So once slavery was ended, they had to find ways and means to continue to earn the money that they had been having, or that they previously been receiving. So one of the things that were implemented after slavery was abolished were black codes. So basically with these black codes, those were certain laws that were applicable only to people because they were black. And as a result, those people were put into prisons and they paid off their fines and fees with an excessive amount of labor. After the black codes kind of went away, but they really didn't go away, what was called peonage laws were put into place. So a lot of people aren't familiar with peonage laws. Thomas Good Jones, who Faulkner's law school is named after, was one of the only judges who fought against peonage laws. So with peonage laws, basically, if, say for instance, my son, who is a 19-year-old black male, was walking down the street and a wealthy white person say, "Hey, you owe me money for this." So he'll kind of have to go work for him for labor until he worked off his debt. So that was another way in which people in this country, or white people in Alabama, gained their wealth. And so from that, once we had the civil rights movement and all of those other things, Jim Crow laws were abolished, then they had to figure out another way or another mechanism in which to make sure that they still received all of the funds that they had previously been received. So we all know that there's only a small percentage of Americans that are wealthy. It's a very small percentage, and they make their money off the backs of those who aren't wealthy. So with prisons, we have people who are making money not only off commissary, but also telecommunications and prison building. That kind of catapults me into what we've been doing in the community to alleviate prisons in the state of Alabama. So myself, along with the founder of Alabama Justice Initiative, LaTanya Tate, we partnered with several organizations inside the state and around the nation for that matter. And we created a coalition by the name of Communities Not Prisons. Well, when the DOJ came in and did their initial finding or their initial report, they indicated, just like you said, that there were so many things that were haphazardly going on in our prisons that it couldn't no longer happen. Alabama has the most dangerous prisons in the nation in terms of suicide, in terms of homicide, and in terms of sexual abuse. So as a result, the DOJ gave Alabama a list of things that they needed to do in order to ensure the inmates, or they don't like to be referred to as inmates, so I usually refer to them as brothers. They gave a list of things that needed to be done on the inside to ensure the brother's safety. So as a result, Alabama thought that it would be brilliant to build new prisons. Nowhere in the DOJ report did it say, hey, build new prisons, that'll make it better. No, they made recommendations as to things that they thought would make the system better. But Alabama didn't want to apply those. So they were going to go get an organization by the name of Core Civic. Core Civic, by every stretch of the imagination, is like the worst entity one of the worst entities that you can think of. So much so that the federal government stopped using them for any privatization services to prisoners because of their lack of concern or their lack of care for the people who are on the inside. So Alabama goes to get Court Civic and to say that they're going to privatize prisons. Keep in mind that the commissioner at that time, Jeff Dunn, said that in order for these prisons to fund themselves, they had to be at least 120% capacity, meaning we wouldn't alleviate prison overcrowding. The prison overcrowding will still be the same. But as a result of the coalition Communities Not Prison and our investors partners, which were from New York, they were able to reach out to these key investors, coupled with our work that we were doing on the ground, and we were able to stop 3 mega prisons from being built in the state of Alabama. So that's just one of the things that we're doing. It's still an ongoing fight, because even after we stopped that prison bill, the legislators came back and say, I got a good idea. The federal government has given us money to help the citizens in our state. But instead of helping the citizens in our state, we're going to go ahead and build new prisons with these. So they allocated $400 million of ARPA money to build new prisons. We were able to slow that bill down tremendously to date. They've only broke that ground on one of those facilities, but that's all they've done is broke ground. If we have anything to do with it, none of those facilities will be built either.
Yes, and I appreciate that. Anything to do with it, because it just doesn't make sense. Thank you for providing that context. I know. So does the Alabama Justice Initiative? You all also do community education and outreach programs, right?
Yeah. So we do. We're big on civic engagement. So just like Restore Your Vote, we go out, those people who have been disenfranchised or think that they have been disenfranchised, we let them know, hey, your crime was not one of moral turpitude. Go ahead and fill out this voting registration paper and you can still vote. Most people don't know that because they figure I've been to prison, so I can't vote. So we work a lot in civic engagement. We also do a program known as participatory defense, whereas we try to help people navigate their way through the criminal justice system. If you don't understand the criminal justice system and how it works, it's a difficult situation to you. So not only are you overwhelmed by the fact that you have a loved one that's on the inside, you're trying to navigate your way through this system that you aren't familiar with in the first place. So with participatory defense, which is a national model, and we have national partners with that as well, we try to help our brothers and sisters navigate their way through the criminal justice system.
How can people find out, how to access those resources?
The website is www.alabamajusticeinitiative.org. I can be reached via email at veronica@alajustice.info. I do respond to my emails. My phone number is 205-377-4070, but you can get me better with email, and I do respond to my email.
Veronica, you hit on something when you were talking about the use of the ARPA funds. And, so failing ineffective criminal justice system, it already has significant economic costs and impacts, like the cost of incarceration, including the cost of maintaining prisons and providing healthcare to incarcerated individuals, is a significant burden, on taxpayers. And then there are economic consequences of incarceration, such as loss of productivity and increased healthcare costs, that whole cycle. Mm-hmm. And during, our last legislative session, our state opted, for folks who may not have caught on to what you were saying, to use funds dedicated. It was part of the American Rescue Plan, funds dedicated for COVID relief. I think it was $400 million to build these new prisons, mm-hmm. right? They took I think our state received $2.2 billion, and our state decided to use $400 million of that to build these 2 new mega prisons. Now,
3. They wanted to build 3.
3. Okay. See, okay. 3. They want to build 3 new mega prisons. Now, the U.S. has one of the highest incarceration rates around the world. We already talked about the cost of maintaining, these systems. But despite the overwhelming evidence that mass incarceration does not work as a deterrent and often exacerbates like the social inequalities that many people continue to see, during imprisonment. And this is just not a viable solution to crime. There are alternatives out there to imprisonment that are more effective at reducing people going back into the system or getting into the system and promoting public safety. There are, restorative justice programs, for example, the focus on, repairing the harm caused of a crime rather than just simply, punishing the offender. And so I wanted to put like a question out there because we talked about, Alabama seeing prisons, building new prisons, just seeing prisons, as a solution. What are some beneficial solutions that you think will be helpful instead of prisons? Like you hear people saying, look, prisons aren't the answer. What are some of the solutions that may, that will be helpful?
So from my end, and I say this every chance I get, education. So I'm a firm believer that if you start children in school, I'm not a firm believer. It has been scientifically proven that if you start kids in school just 1 year earlier, it will cut these prison numbers in half. So in other words, we're going to be proactive instead of reactive. So we're going to go ahead and Alabama has an excellent pre-K system. We just don't have it in all schools. My cousin has a 3-year-old who will be 4 this school year, and she had to enter a lottery to get into pre-K. Like that's ridiculous. For her to have to enter a lottery to get into pre-K, but you'll allocate $400 million to prisons. Like that makes no sense to me. But in my opinion, the fix to overcrowding of prisons or mass incarceration is education on the front end. Start these kids in school at 3-4 years old and let them move their way through the system. Those children are likely to do better in math and science. It'll put money back in parents' pockets. And me as a taxpayer, I'm tired of taking care of grown people. So I'm tired of using money that could go towards my household to build prisons with. Like that makes no sense to me. I would much rather invest in something that I know is going to give me an outcome, or it's going to give me some revenue, generate a revenue stream on the front end, than to invest in something on the back end like prisons. I'd rather invest in these kids, but that's a whole soapbox for me. So I could talk about that all day, but education to me is the key on the front end.
When you think about restorative justice programs or approaches, alternatives to prisons, what does anything come to mind for you?
When I think about, what we should be doing with the criminal legal system, I think the big question comes up is like, we can talk about sort of the individual policies that we could be implementing, but I think that the problem is that politicians aren't aligned with the people on what the overall goal of this system should be. Veronica just put a lot of ideas out there that are about reducing harm, right? I think that a lot of people agree, especially restorative justice advocates, that that's what we should be trying to do, is reduce harm. And that looks bigger than the sort of tools that have been provided for us. It extends into all parts of community and life, to education, to sort of anti-poverty programs, thinking big about these solutions that reduce harm. On the other hand, we have politicians who will, put out these platforms that are all about being tough on crime, and they're saying that their goal is deterrence or rehabilitation or restraint, which may be legitimate goals of the criminal legal system, but the solutions they're using don't achieve those goals. So we have to ask, is that even really what you want? We know that that's not what we want. We want harm reduction. That's what we want to focus on. But you're not even implementing policies that do what you say you're doing. So that leads me to want to dig under the surface of what they're saying. And then you get to this issue with private prisons. A private prison company is legally obligated to prioritize profit over everything else. They are not prioritizing rehabilitation. They are not prioritizing restoration. They're not prioritizing deterrence. They are legally obligated. CoreCivic is a publicly traded company. It is legally obligated to maximize profit through incarcerating human beings. So of course it's making choices that are leading to inhumane care. And that politicians are trying to make contracts with a company that has that goal shows that their stated goals are not even really their goals. And so we have to ask the question of why that is. How has the private prison industry captured Alabama's government and driven their goal setting in this way? And that sort of comes back to building that political power to say, no, we want something else. We want harm reduction. We want restorative justice. And then we can get to those solutions that Veronica is putting on the table that, like she said, are tried and true harm reduction methods.
Thanks, Blair, for that. You're absolutely right. I think we see a lot of times with politicians in Alabama, they think that if they give these alternatives and restorative justice programs that they are seen as soft on crime, and they want to, make this statement that they're like firm on crime and that, there'll be no crime in this state that people don't go to prison for. The reality is that restorative justice and community-based programs, they can be more effective at reducing crime in the long run than imprisonment. So we know that investing in alternatives to incarceration and improving conditions within the state's facilities, we can work toward a more just and equitable criminal justice system that benefits all members of our society. So instead of making investments in inmates and helping provide them with education, mental health services, drug and alcohol rehab, and even shorter sentences, we've seen the state's response be just simply to invest in mega prisons rather than invest in the people. So I'm going to pose this question to, I guess, both of y'all. Why do you think that the state legislature refuses to invest in people serving time, and what misconceptions are you seeing?
I hate to sound like the 1960s civil rights activists, but we have a government that's led by white Republican males. I mean, I don't see, that's the only reason that I can come up with, and it's all against a group of people. Black people make up about 27% of the population, but we make up about 51% of the prison population. So we can say all day that it's not about race, but it's most definitely a systemic racial factor that's leading us to this current position.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I mean, the political system is skewed because of systemic voter suppression, disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, both political and racial gerrymandering. So what the legislature is doing and what politicians are doing doesn't represent the will of the people, because the mechanisms, the procedures that we have in place to get people who share our policy preferences into office and hold them accountable don't work. And that is, again, by design. That's how the Alabama's 1901 Constitution was designed to reenact slavery through the prison system and simultaneously take away political rights from people that it was targeting with that same criminal legal system. It was always designed that way, and that cycle has not been broken, and it needs to be broken for the will of the people to be heard on this issue.
No, definitely. And since the Alabama legislature has been slow to make the necessary changes, and as you both put it, they're about holding on to power and oppressing, certain groups. Like, we can't talk about it. We can't have this discussion without bringing in race. So, Veronica, you're not sounding like the 1960 civil rights activists. You are sounding like the 2023 present day activists. This issue, unfortunately, is still here. So, and it's important for people to tap in. One of the best things that people can do also is to, contact their elected representatives and advocate for, criminal justice reform. This can include advocating for more investments in, restorative justice or alternative programs to prisons, as well as reforms to the sentencing and parole systems that will reduce the number of people in prison. People can also support organizations like the Alabama Justice Initiative and the Campaign Legal Center that are working to improve the conditions and increase accountability, in Alabama's prison.
Yes, so thank you, Veronica and Blair, for joining us today and offering your valuable insight on the condition of Alabama's prisons and the overall issues that plague our criminal justice system.
Yeah, but wait, before we go. We're doing something new this season. Y'all got to get on the soapbox. And the soapbox is the place where you get a chance to rant for 60 seconds. Feel free to tear a hole in whoever or whatever, but keep it clean. The kids are watching and listening as they should be. So do we have any volunteers? Okay, of course, Veronica. Come on down. All right, so let's get you on the soapbox.
So the irony of you asking me this question, I made a post on social media yesterday that said that we are so concerned about being Democrat and Republican, so we have failed to realize that we are literally losing an entire generation to fentanyl overdoses and social media. So we're so concerned about what the Democrats are doing, what the Republicans are doing, until we've forgotten about our children. So it's almost like the mommy and the daddy are going through a divorce. And as a result of the divorce, the children have to bear all the consequences, or they have to bear all the baggage that comes along with the divorce. At some point, we have to make our children our number one priority. At some point, we have to become purple. At some point, we have to put Democrat and Republican totally to the side and do what's best for the people. And not even all people, y'all. And when I say not all people, I'm primarily concerned with our children. These are our future. This is our future. We have to make sure that they're in a place to take care of us once we get elderly. I mean, I'm older now. But the way we're going and the way that we are losing people, the way that we are losing children to overdoses is absolutely appalling. But still, we aren't taking the steps that we need to ensure. Okay, I'm done.
We done kicked you off the box. All right, Blair, come on down.
So, we've just been talking about the importance of folks who have been directly impacted by the criminal legal system being able to exercise their right to vote. And one thing that is really enraging me that I'm hearing from a lot of people who are trying to figure out if they can vote, is that they've heard about these prosecutions of people who voted when they were ineligible in Florida. And that scares them and makes them not even want to try, even when they are in fact eligible. They don't want to exercise that right to vote. So that really pisses me off, because I am super mad at Florida for getting into this situation. Florida set up a system that was basically designed to fail. They passed a very confusing law that took the right to vote away from almost 1 million people who had gotten their right to vote back through a ballot initiative. And then they swore to the federal courts that they were going to be in charge of making sure that everyone who tried to register, it was up to the state to check their eligibility and up to the state to check the voter rolls to make sure ineligible people weren't on there. They swore they were going to do that. They didn't do it. And now what they're doing instead is going after people who made good faith mistakes about their eligibility. And that's having a ripple effect into states like Alabama all around the country. And we shouldn't stand for it.
Thank you. So you may be wondering how you can get connected and stay involved and informed around the fight for justice and other social issues. Definitely tune into future A Different Frame episodes. The podcast is streaming on all platforms where you can listen to podcasts, and you can also catch the video version, aka the podcast, on our social media platforms at AV Progress and on our YouTube channel at Alabama Values Progress. Be sure to check out our website at www.alabamavaluesprogress.org. So follow, subscribe, and share. And that is all for today's episode. This new Jim Crow gots to go. Why Alabama keeps putting prisons over people. Join us next week. We'll be talking about reproductive justice and reproductive rights for our episode on Abort the Patriarchy. We'll be joined by Jen Ferris of Progress Now and Jen Fountain of Yellowhammer Fund. Thank you.